The Chicago Bears are again tweaking their offensive line combinations, trying some different things. Teven Jenkins working with the backups. And all of that has led to another round of overreactions in June.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On the show today, we start with this Bears offensive line. Practice again open to the media late last week. We got to see a new offensive line combination, which included last year's second-round pick, Teven Jenkins, working with the backups, and this year's fifth-round pick, well, one of them, Braxton Jones, as the first-team left tackle, Larry Borom, then first-team right tackle. And so all of a sudden, there's a big hullabaloo about, Jenkins with the backups and the offensive line rotation and a change at right guard as well. And again, the sky is falling in June. So we'll kind of look at, what exactly happened, what the plan is on the offensive line, and go through this idea of trying to get the best 5 offensive linemen on the field and look at what that might look like now, given a couple of the free agent additions they made and, of course, the 4 draft picks on the offensive line and how some of these different dynamics might play out. We'll wrap up with a quick callback to the Bears canceled OTA practice last week. We got more of an explanation on what exactly happened and what was the lead up here that answered a lot of the questions we had when we talked about it on last week's podcast. But we start with this offensive line. The Bears have said all along they're going to try players at different positions, tweak some different combinations this time of year, and then hopefully try and settle on something as early and as far away from week 1 as possible. And so some fairly significant and major changes we mentioned there. Larry Borom to right tackle, Teven Jenkins to the backup spot, and the rookie Braxton Jones in as the starting left tackle, rookie out of Southern Utah, in his first OTAs halfway through getting those first team reps on Justin Fields' blind side. And so all of a sudden, big hubbub, commotion, pick your euphemism for uproar about this change as some sort of now reflection on Teven Jenkins. But I guess first, let's hear Matt Eberflus kind of give his explanation for what the team is working with there with his offensive line rotation.
Right, so early on in the OTAs, remember we talked about the you guys asked a question about the tackles, and I don't remember what media member it was, but we said, hey, we're going to move guys around and shift guys around. So it's the halfway point for us. Right, so we had 6 practices, and then we got 6 or 7 to go at that point when we made the switch, and we wanted to change combinations. And that's not the only combinations we've changed. From tackle, tackle. We've moved some receivers around. Some guys are playing X, some guys are playing Z. We adjusted some guys on the defensive line. So we've done those things just to really find out, have a true evaluation of what's the best fit for us going forward in the training camp. We might like the other combination. We might like this combination. We might not like, either one of them. Now let's go to the one here in training camp. So we'll figure out what the best thing is. And that's really just more information for the coaches to find out what's best for the Bears.
Is that the same thing with Larry Borom playing right tackle on Teven Jenkins? Looked like he was
same
today. Okay.
Yep. It's the same. It's exactly the same. So we're just trying to find the best combination of people, especially when you're looking at the offensive line. Who's the best 5 guys out there so we can succeed? And it creates competition when you do that. When you're moving guys around, who can function at different spots and who can really execute.
How much are pads a game changer for situations like that? When you're in pads and full speed and practice, can that totally change everything? I mean, isn't that when you really see what you've got?
That's your true evaluation when you get pads on. I've been in this a long time, and I've seen guys, man, they look great all the way through this part of the year, and then the pads come on and they stay on, and it's like pad number 4 or 5 in training camp, and then all of a sudden you see a guy slide. It's just because of the physicality of the game. Some guys are really suited to that, and those are the guys who succeed in the NFL. The guys that are not suited to that, they have a harder time, having that long success.
Some key points here, I think, that I take away from it is that, first of all, we should never strongly react to what happens in practices in June. I think that's just generally a steadfast rule, other than injuries, right? That's the one thing that can happen at a practice in June that has super important, tangible impacts on the upcoming season. But other than that, what happens at practices in June, I think, can at best be an indicator perhaps for what could happen at practices in August at training camp. Those are the times when these types of rotational decisions start to have a real, I think, credibility and impact to them. Credibility not in terms of like, do we believe that it actually happened, but credibility in terms of like, will it actually matter, and importance. And I think at this stage, yes, it's not, I don't think it's completely nothing. I don't think it's meaningless, but I think it's not worth getting caught up about, oh no, what does this say about Teven Jenkins? And does this mean he's falling behind? And is this a doom for his career and for this season? I think it probably indicates something positive about Braxton Jones, that they felt like he earned some opportunities with the first team. I think it does say, it probably indicates something about Teven Jenkins in the sense that he's not like killing it so hard or so well, or maybe you could see it both ways. That either he's so good that they feel like they can move him around and know they can throw him back at left tackle whenever and feel good about it, and now they're just testing out, getting him back on the right side and working with the backups and doing some different things. Could be an indication that maybe he isn't performing at this stage as well as they might want him to be. But again, it's the whole key there is at this stage. They've said all along they're going to move different guys around. They made a change at right guard, putting Sam Mustipher to the backups and Dakota Dozier with the starters, which we'll talk about more in a little bit here. But like they've been saying all along, the real evaluation happens when the pads come on. And some players play really well without the pads and then struggle when the pads come back on, or maybe vice versa. And so let's slow down. Let's not get too caught up here in Teven Jenkins with the backups. Same thing like with Jalen Johnson. He's back with the starters. Crisis averted. Nothing crazy happening there either. So let's slow it down here with Teven Jenkins as we start to figure out, okay, what will this starting offensive line combination look like? Because they do have guys that can play multiple positions and some different types of experiences to find that group of the best 5. We'll kind of go through the candidates at each spot. It's just really 3 of them up in the air, 2 not so much. Next on Locked On Bears. With our friends at BlueNile.com, you can celebrate all of life's special moments, from creating the custom engagement ring of her dreams to giving a classic and timeless jewelry piece, all at prices you won't find at traditional jewelers. BlueNile.com is not some, flashy pop-up out of nowhere thing. Blue Nile has been a dedicated, consistent online jeweler for multiple decades. So whether you're ready to pop the question or you're celebrating a milestone moment, find jewelry as unique as her with the modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. And you don't have to deal with any of the middleman salespeople taking commissions and increasing that price of your jewelry piece. That's how Blue Nile is able to keep their prices affordable for everyone. So no matter what you're looking for, Blue Nile has jewelry experts on hand 24/7 to help you find that perfect piece. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners are going to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. That is a podcast exclusive, and it includes engagement. Just use our promo code Locked On. That's LOCKEDON, Locked On. Every order is insured, it ships for free, and it arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com today. Chicago Bears are in this process of finding the best 5 starting offensive linemen. And again, the Bears are not going to be able to determine the best 5 in June when the players don't have the pads on, which is why, again, I don't think it's this humongous panic deal that Teven Jenkins is getting some time with the backups. I would bet there will be other times when Larry Borom gets with the backups, because that's the other thing about this that we didn't touch on, is that only like 1 or 2 practices a week are open to the media. And even the media is a little limited on what they can report on what they see at practice. And so there will be other times that other rotations are made that we don't see and get to hear about or know about. And none of those rotations are reflections on those players and their, career or their outlook with the Bears organization. Like I said, it can be an indicator of like, okay, what this tells me is we should take a close eye. We could keep a close eye on what Teven Jenkins does at training camp, right? It makes him someone to look at more closely, keep an eye on, and monitor more than we might have otherwise. But I don't think it indicates anything more serious than that. So then when you start to figure out, okay, what does this best 5 offensive line combination look like with the way the roster stands right now? That's a caveat because of the word right now. Between now and training camp, or even after training camp starts, the team could see this offensive line in pads, be more concerned about this offensive line than perhaps they are right now once they see them in pads, and then potentially add another offensive tackle or another right guard candidate, and then change the math on who's going to line up where. But I think this rotation at least inserts Braxton Jones more firmly into the conversation, at least. I'm not here to say, oh, Jones is going to be one of your best 5 offensive linemen and going to be starting week 1. No, I don't think that's, at this stage, a realistic expectation for a 5th-round pick out of Southern Utah. But I do think it's something you can keep in maybe at least the realm of possibility. Is that a fair way we can sort of differentiate it there? That it's more, it feels more possible now than it did before. I think we can say for sure Lucas Patrick, when healthy, is your starting center. Cody Whitehair, when healthy, starting left guard. Those 2 spots locked in. We've known that since Lucas Patrick was signed in free agency, and they confirmed exactly where he was going to play on this offensive line. We've been sort of operating under the general assumption that your starting tackles in some combination would be Teven Jenkins and Larry Borom. And initially it was, you were getting some Larry Borom at left tackle with Teven Jenkins at right tackle. I think we've seen both of them play both sides as they're trying to figure out this preseason rotation here. But with Jenkins moving to the second team here, now you're getting Braxton Jones at left tackle. Maybe that's more an evaluation on Larry Borom of like, oh, we're not seeing as much as we want from Borom, on that left side, for example. So now we want to try Borom at that right tackle spot with Braxton Jones as that left tackle and see what your other options are there. I mean, there's a lot of different ways this could go. I'm almost more concerned about Dakota Dozier getting starting right guard reps over Sam Mustipher. Not because all of a sudden this means Sam Mustipher is bad or whatever, but just because Dakota Dozier has been largely terrible for large amounts of his career. Nothing against the human being and the person individually, but the on-field performance has been no bueno. And that's not something I want in my starting offensive line. And ideally, you would have good enough depth that he wouldn't make your 53-man roster. So that right guard spot is more of a concern for me right now, even than how they're going to rotate these 2 offensive tackles. It would seem like for sure, obviously one of Larry Borom or Teven Jenkins right now is going to be one of your starting offensive tackles for sure. And then it's a combination of like, okay, if Braxton Jones, for example, as a rookie, somehow steps into training camp, puts the pads on, continues to practice really well, and it maybe is the surprise of the draft right now and is good enough to start week 1 at left tackle, then maybe whether you start Teven Jenkins or Larry Borom at right tackle, does the other then become a right guard candidate? When Larry Borom came out of the draft, there was some discussion as to whether or not he would have to kick inside to guard in his NFL career because he wouldn't have necessarily the mobility in space to hold up at offensive tackle in the NFL. The Bears have had him and other linemen all lose weight and become more mobile, so maybe that helps in that process for him staying at tackle. But the same kind of thing could be said for Teven Jenkins. Could he, if he's struggling for whatever reason at tackle and Braxton Jones becomes the starter out of nowhere, and maybe Larry Borom is then your better option at right tackle in this hypothetical, could Teven Jenkins then still be one of your 5 best offensive linemen, and you try and plug him in at right guard? We haven't heard at this point any specific reporting of either of them practicing at guard as of yet, but I wouldn't rule it out of the possibility of something that could happen in training camp or could happen when we're not looking, when it's not open to the public or the media. Because if you just try to rank, not even in order, but just pick, okay, who are the 5 most talented offensive linemen on the Bears? The 5 players, regardless of position, that you trust the most. I mean, obviously in some order. I'm not here to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but Cody Whitehair, Lucas Patrick for sure. Then for me, it's probably some combination of Teven Jenkins, Larry Borom, and then right now, Sam Mustipher, right? I mean, that would seem like, from what we know at this stage, those guys have probably been your 5 best, most talented players right now. Braxton Jones might be practicing his way into that conversation. I don't think Dakota Dozier belongs in that top 5 or even that top 6, and ideally not that top 7. I mean, Sean Coleman, when healthy, the veteran that they signed just after the draft, he's earlier in his career played as though he would be one of the Bears' current 5 best offensive linemen. It's been 3 years since he's played at that level, so I'm not going to put him there yet, but I think there's some of that possibility in there. And then, there's a lot to like about Zachary Thomas, especially the 6th-round pick out of San Diego State, has been a name that's been thrown around as a potential surprise guy there. And, Doug Kramer, the center from Illinois, is going to be in that conversation as well. But I think, they're a step above some of the other camp body guys. Latavius Simmons played a little bit last year, or, Willie Wright's kind of a no-name there, Dieter Iselin. At this point, once you get to that point, you're kind of splitting hairs on backup quality players. But it does feel like right now, the 5 guys you might trust or know the most are Whitehair, Patrick, Jenkins, Borom, and probably Mustipher number 5, with Braxton Jones maybe competing in there. Some of the other rookies could surprise. There's room for guys to move in and out of that 5, but at least those top 4 seem to be for sure 4 of your 5 best guys based on what we know right now. We'll see if the rest of OTAs and training camp changes some of that, and once the pads come on, that'll really give them the answer. So that's why, again, that best 5 is not going to be decided in June. And Teven Jenkins' career and his role this season is not going to be decided by practicing with some backups in June. Jalen Johnson did the same thing. Let's see if that continues. I guess is kind of the biggest factor there. At least the Bears were back at practice after having to have one of their practices canceled last week because they went too hard and were too physical in an earlier practice earlier this offseason. We'll check in again on what happened, and we finally got some answers to some of our biggest questions of how the NFL find out, what were they doing, and how are they punished for it, next on Locked On Bears. Listen, just because we're in June and it's the downtime of football doesn't mean you can't get some football bets down. And our friends at betonline.net are here to help with all of your sports betting needs. You can bet ahead for this upcoming season. The Bears win total this season, over under 6.5, is where that line sits right now. Bears are a little bit of a long shot to make the playoffs. Right now at BetOnline, it is yes is plus 300, no is minus 400. Plus then you've got NBA Finals bets, NHL playoffs nearing the Stanley Cup Finals now too, Major League Baseball in the thick of things, plus all of your fights, your boxing, your UFC, your MMA, e-betting, your esports, live betting, and so much more. BetOnline is going to be your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, news, and odds. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the different trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. Last week, we had a lot of questions about how the Bears' OTA practice led up to getting canceled, right? We knew that there was some rules violations. The Chicago Tribune had reported that apparently they had been going a little bit too intense and too much contact in what were otherwise supposed to be non-contact practices. And so, we sort of knew the what, but we didn't exactly know the how and exactly I guess we sort of knew the why, I guess. But we're wondering, okay, how does this get reported? How does it get handed down? The Players Association got involved. The league got involved. Did the players have to get involved in getting their union involved, and how does this all work? And so I was glad that we got to hear from Cole Kmet, as he is one of the Bears Players Association union reps, and he explained a little bit more about the process for them, about finding out, and then how they sort of handled it from there, and some of the explanation for what really kind of happened.
Yeah, so obviously we got the ruling a little later on, Monday night? So I knew we were kind of aware of it a little bit, that they were looking into it, but just didn't think anything of it. And then when we heard of it, we just kind of took it for what it was. So really not much to it. Lost the practice and back at it today.
You're a union rep, right?
Yeah, now I am. Yeah.
What was your role in this? Did you have conversations with?
Yeah. So our PA rep just kind of notified us, like, hey, we're looking at. They were at the earlier mini camps. They saw it, things like that. So just kind of notifying us. But in terms of us like playing a role in anything, like we really don't have that much going on with that. So.
Were you surprised, Cole? Were you surprised that this happened? Like that they thought it was too intense, or you were making too much contact? Have you felt that?
Well, you got to look at our situation right now. We got a lot of young guys, right? New coach, new everything, and guys are coming in to prove themselves, and that's including me. So when someone says, you're going 100%, you're going 100%, and I'm not gonna back down. I'm not gonna ease up anywhere because. First of all, I don't want to get hurt. That's how you get hurt. You're not going 100%. And guys want to show what they got. So when you run that line, and we don't have as many vets as we've had in years past, just because naturally we're a younger team. So it's kind of just where we're at right now. And guys are learning. I thought this past week and these past two practices we've had have been night and day, much better than in terms of how guys have been practicing, in terms of how to practice without pads on and things like that. So I think it's really just a thing that we're learning through, and I guess it's just one of the consequences of it.
Would it be fair to say that generally speaking, the players were pleased that the practice was canceled, or that they came down on you guys because they were protecting you guys?
Yeah, I got to golf 18 holes yesterday.
Of course. Cole, you said a PA rep is here, so is that a case where they see it, or is somebody informing them?
No, I know they make their rounds, so they stop by. So he was here, making their rounds, probably saw some stuff, requested film, things like that. So we really, like I said, we really don't, unless we have a serious issue with anything, we're not really going to the reps with stuff. The things I think we complain the most about is when we're getting our money from the COVID year. So that's all we hear about from us, but that's it.
I'm left feeling like a lot of the loose ends were tied up there, right? There was some questions about like, okay, when it's the Players Association, is it players like reporting to the league and saying, hey, like we were like being upset that the practice was being too physical, and going to their union and say, hey, help us, protect us. But the explanation there much more, it makes a lot of sense that like there are certain reps from the Players Association that are not the team's union reps. Like, so the Bears have like 2 or 3 players that are their representatives in the union, but the union has like, I don't know, call them employees or whatever. They use the same word, rep, but like a person who works for the union and is not a player on the team that will go around to each team's practices and observe. And that was one of the questions I had, is like, does the NFL like have officials, like not referees, but like workers, like people, company employees that monitor these practices? And the answer was actually yes. They don't monitor every practice, but like Cole was saying, they make their rounds, and the players don't really like go to them with that kind of stuff unless it's a super major serious thing that needs to be like specifically investigated. So I think I pretty well buy the majority of the explanation there, right? That, yeah, it is a lot of young players, and the staff is pushing them to go 100% and to prove themselves and to hustle and have intensity, and that it's not the end of the world to lose a practice, and it may have been worth it to lose that practice because these practices don't matter that much in June. But if you can squeeze some extra out of a bunch of them and then lose one as a result, I think you may end up still coming out ahead there in terms of what it provides for your team. And Komet made a good point there that I hadn't thought about, where it's like you want to go 100% because if you ease up too much, you could get hurt, right? If you're sort of like being too deliberate and intentional, then you're not being as loose, and you're trying to be careful, and you're thinking about it too much, and that you can have, in the same sense that you can have injuries from going too hard and being too physical, you can also have injuries from like not being as loose and fast and free with it, right? Because you're trying so hard to avoid, that extra last piece hit that you maybe adjust slightly differently, and you can put yourself in awkward positions and ultimately end up being a negative that way too. So Komet pointed out, I think, later that no one got hurt as a result of them being too intense at these practices. It was just guys ended up on the ground a little bit too much. And that's, I think, at this point, all's well that ends well a little bit with that. Like, doesn't seem like it's a huge deal. And I'm glad to kind of, that there wasn't like, some kind of like player, not revolt, but like, it wasn't like, oh, the players are upset with how hard Eberflus is pushing them. And so they sort of tattletale to the union and say, hey, well, not tattletale, that's too trivializing. But like, what I mean? That they sort of go to their union and say, hey, somebody's got to step in here because this is not right and this is a violation of the rules, like sort of turning their own coaches in. And no, that was not the case at all. It was just, there was a monitoring. They were monitored. They were informed. Not a big deal. I think it's a fair explanation. I still think the coaching staff is probably skirting away with less blame than they should get here, where it's like they are asking for intensity and hustle, but they should also be better about that. I mean, it is sort of, like, Komet tried to take some of the blame on the players and say, yeah, we're just going hard and being intense, but at the same time, like, the coaches are the ones running the practice. And if your players are being too intense and violating the rules in this way, you need to stop them from doing so and still get the ideal practice that you want as coaches. So, like, I do think there's some blame to go around there, but I don't think it's a big deal or anything to be really concerned about. That was the other part of the criticism, right? Is like, oh, is this coaching staff sloppy? Another mistake by Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles this offseason? Do they know how to run an organization? I don't see that as a big deal. I don't see this as some big dereliction of duty or some sort of big, blind spot or big mistake that they made that indicates that they're bad at their jobs. I think it's just, kind of a fluky thing and something that also happens to other teams more than you might realize, because it doesn't make national news. It's not the top story on ESPN when the Bears have a practice canceled. So I think that, teams like the 49ers and Buccaneers and other teams have been fined for this kind of thing before in recent years. So it's not exclusive to the Bears, and no one makes a big deal that much when other teams do it either. So I think we can sort of put a bow on that and lay it to rest and say, you know what? It was a thing. It was not perfect, not ideal, but not a big deal. Not going to be a huge problem. The rest of the, by the time the season's going to go around, not going to affect how many games they win or lose this season or next season or any season. It's just a little blip in the offseason radar and gave us something new and interesting to talk about that we don't get to always kind of explore every offseason. And we learned more about how the Players Association works and how they monitor practice for those kind of things. So I think, all things considered, a story that was bigger than it needed to be, but still interesting and something we can learn from it and take away from it as well. Certainly, any and all updates we get on OTA practices and veteran mini camps throughout the rest of this month, and then, of course, training camp, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Love all the feedback we get from listeners. And shout out to Alex Gaspar, I think that's how you say his last name, Gaspar, from Lazy Jane's Cafe and Bakery. I was getting breakfast literally this morning, or I guess when you listen to this, yesterday morning. I'm in line ordering my breakfast sandwich, and guy behind making the coffee goes, hey, do you host a daily Chicago Bears podcast? And I was like, yeah. So it's all super, like, I'm not somebody who gets like recognized in public, and I don't see myself as any kind of like celebrity or even like known public figure in any way, but it was super cool. It only happens a handful of times when somebody will recognize me from the podcast. So shout out to Alex at Lazy Jane's. Great dude. He and his friend, I don't remember what he said his friend's name was, but he said he and his friend have been longtime listeners, listen to this podcast. Certainly, if you ever see me in public, which again is extremely rare, but do not be shy to come up and say hello. I'm not a celebrity. I'm not someone you have to feel like, oh, I'm going to be bothering him or whatever. I'm just a guy who does a podcast. And I really appreciate everyone who listens in and follows along. We'll be here for you all off season long, albeit for the rest of this month and a lot of July. It'll be 3 days a week instead of 5. We slow down in this part of the off season when there's just not nearly as much going on, but we'll ramp back up for training camp. We'll have you ready for this regular season and whatever's going to happen in year 1 under Matt Eberflus and year 2 under Justin Fields. Still think there's plenty to be excited about and still plenty of reasons to bear down.